right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm very excited. Let's talk about some aliens. So, like was already stated, my name is Dr. Suldovsky, and I study public understanding of science. And a couple of years ago, NASA convened a working group or a workshop to try to understand how we can better communicate the search for life in the universe. And one of the key takeaways from that workshop for me was that not a lot of research exists about the way that the public thinks about the search for extraterrestrial life, especially from a scientific or science communication perspective. So we're going to talk about some original research I conducted after that workshop to try and better understand Americans' perceptions. So we are going to talk about communicating about the search for life in space, generally speaking, kind of where we are, and give a little bit of background, and then I'll present some study research questions and my study methods and some preliminary results that are unpublished, so it's kind of a sneak peek, and then some key points and future directions, and I would love to do Q&A too. I'm hoping we'll have plenty of time for that. So when thinking about communicating about the search for life in space, first and foremost, right, it's an important scientific endeavor. So a lot of money is put into the scientific effort to find life in space. And whether that's microbial life or intelligent life, we spend a lot of time, money, and effort looking for life existing in the universe outside of planet Earth. At the same time, finding life or the prospect of life existing outside of our own planet is really complex, and it's laden with a lot of moral and philosophical implications. It is one of the few types of science that where discoveries in it could actually fundamentally change the way we see ourselves, the way we see our humanity, the way we see the purpose of life, and a whole bunch of other really big, important questions. And as a result of that, public perception surrounding the issue is likely to vary widely and be informed by a lot of things, including culture, religion, science knowledge and science perceptions, media use, media environments, and there's probably a whole bunch of variables that might influence the way someone perceives the search for life in space as a scientific endeavor. And importantly, most research to date examines beliefs about extraterrestrial life from a supernatural or paranormal or anomalistic perspective. So when I was looking for literature on what does the public think about this, aside from Pew Research Center that surveys Americans about space science, the vast majority of the peer-reviewed social scientific research that's published treats it as a conspiratorial belief or a paranormal belief or a supernatural belief. And so oftentimes it's studied alongside things like belief in witchcraft, for example. And so there was a really important hole in the literature that I noticed that not a lot of peer-reviewed literature from the science comm side exists. And so I am trying to fill that gap. So because of the complex landscape, because of the likely complexity of public perception surrounding this type of science, communicating about it and any discoveries that we might make is incredibly challenging. And very, very little guidance exists for science communicators, especially if you compare it to issues like climate change or GMOs, where there's a lot of peer-reviewed literature telling us how people think about those issues and how to message them and communicate with them and engage with them. In comparison, hardly any guidance exists for folks looking to communicate about this type of science. And again, there's a lack of research to date on public perception from a science comm perspective, right, which likely underlies that lack of guidance. And so a lot of the guidance that's provided is based off of adjacent disciplines or related topics. So, we can borrow from like risk communication or other fields like that. But not a lot of work exists to kind of guide communicators in this space specifically. And so the study I'm about to share with you today aims to help fill that gap. And just a quick note, there is a lot of data here. It's a big survey. This kind of what I'm presenting today scratches the surface. And I am, super curious to hear what you all think. So first, for the research questions that guided this work initially, number one, I wanted to know, to what extent do Americans believe that extraterrestrial life exists? Number two, to what extent do Americans support the scientific search for extraterrestrial life? So because not a lot of research exists, not a lot of peer-reviewed research in particular exists about how Americans see this as a scientific endeavor. I wanted to make sure to address that. And then number three, what is the relationship between the support for scientific search for life and conspiratorial thinking? So because the vast majority of research that exists to date has treated it like an anomalistic or supernatural or paranormal belief, a lot of the research examines it kind of in adjacent to conspiratorial thinking. So, you know, how does belief in aliens fit into one's conspiratorial worldview, for example? And so I wanted to know, what is the relationship then between the way that Americans are thinking about it as a scientific issue, but also how they're thinking about it as a conspiracy? And really, the work was mostly guided by the idea that we need to understand American audiences because the public, as we know, is not a monolith. And so if we're treating it only like a conspiratorial belief, right, we're leaving out a whole bunch of people. If we treat it just as a scientific issue, we're leaving out a whole bunch of people. And so I wanted to collect enough data that we could kind of get a better understanding of the different audiences that exist for this kind of science communication. And then fourth, what are Americans' engagement preferences surrounding the search for extraterrestrial life? And more specifically, how much do they trust NASA to protect and engage the public? So for methods, it was an online survey of US adults in 2024, ran by the survey company Qualtrics. So it is 1,619 participants. In terms of participant demographics, ages range from 18 to 91, with the average age of 47. Gender was 50% women, so I had a quota for gender to make sure it was half women, half men. In terms of race, it's 60% white, 23% black, and 16% other racial categories. The average education the range of education for participants was less than high school all the way up to a doctoral degree, with the average education level for these participants being some college. In terms of political ideology, about a third of the sample was liberal, 43% moderate, and about a quarter were conservative. The average income of participants was $40,000 to $60,000 a year, and I also measured religious affiliation, but also religiosity, which will come up in this talk. But in terms of religious affiliation, about half of the sample was Christian. Other religions represented included Judaism. We had Muslims, Buddhists, Hindu atheists, and agnostics. For measures, so to measure extraterrestrial beliefs or beliefs surrounding extraterrestrial life, I used the extraterrestrial belief scale. And this scale has 4 components, and so it addresses the existence of alien life, kind of general beliefs. And here are the questions on the screen now. So the questions for this scale include things like, Earth is the only planet in the universe that harbors life. That item's reverse coded. Given the age and the size of the universe, it's very likely that extraterrestrial life must exist. If Earth-like planets exist in the universe, then it's likely that Earth-like organisms have evolved on those planets. So these 6 items help capture someone's kind of general belief that extraterrestrial life does indeed exist in the universe. And so you can see the mean score. So this is a 5-point agreement scale for all of these items. And the mean score is 3.8. So belief in the general existence of extraterrestrial life is fairly high. And you can see the reliability statistics on the screen as well. And the second part of the scale is extraterrestrial visitation. So not only did I want to know, do Americans think alien life exists, but I also wanted to know, do they think aliens have already visited Earth? And so these are the questions on the screen here for this section of the scale, including extraterrestrial creatures visited Earth in the distant past or at the dawn of human civilization. Intelligent extraterrestrial life has visited Earth. Crop circle patterns, which is one of my favorite questions, are caused by the actions of extraterrestrials. And then it also asked about ancient monuments, such as the pyramids of Egypt, or evidence of extraterrestrial life. And you can see the mean there on the screen is 3.02, and then had high reliability as well for that. A third part of the scale is extraterrestrial cover-ups. So this is the extent to which people believe that powerful groups are covering up evidence of extraterrestrial life. So you can see the questions on the screen. It asks about government, military, and scientists. And also had very high reliability, and the mean score for that is 3.19. So you can see that Americans do kind of harbor some beliefs that there is some cover-ups by powerful groups, specifically military, scientists, and the government. And then support for the scientific search for extraterrestrial life. Specifically, the scale asks, again, on an agreement scale, the search for extraterrestrial life is a serious and important scientific endeavor. The search for extraterrestrial life is a waste of time and money, which is reverse coded. listening out for radio signals, and it asks about, the search for extraterrestrial life as a pseudoscience, which is also reverse coded, so to get a sense of American support for it as a scientific endeavor. I didn't feel like the scale, the extraterrestrial belief scale went far enough in terms of people's kind of lived experience with extraterrestrial life. So I also found a scale that measured personal experiences with aliens and UFOs. So I am going to be covering, the scale is longer than this, but I'm going to be covering these first 8 items that ask people about either their direct lived experience or others, people that they know, their lived experience. So again, it's an agreement scale, and the questions ask things, or statements are things like, I believe that I've had direct contact with an extraterrestrial here on Earth. I personally know someone who's been taken aboard the spaceship of extraterrestrials and then returned back to Earth. I personally know of someone who's had an experience that I believe is evidence of the existence of extraterrestrials, and so on. It also asks about UFOs. You can see the last couple of questions. I personally know someone who I believe has seen a UFO in the sky that was an extraterrestrial spaceship, and I've seen at least one UFO in the sky that I believe was an extraterrestrial spaceship. The mean is 1.91. You can see the reliability statistics, so it's a very reliable scale. For communication measures, I asked about engagement preferences and also perceptions of NASA. So for engagement preferences, I modified concepts of the different models of science communication, the different models of engagement, to quantify and hopefully measure people's support for that type of engagement. So for the deficit model, I asked, how important is it for scientists and experts to, number one, provide the public with information about current projects and findings relating to the search for extraterrestrial life. So that's the deficit model. Number two, seek feedback from the public to better understand their values and beliefs about the search for extraterrestrial life, which is the dialogue model, and then collaborate with the public to figure out how we should deal with extraterrestrial life if it is discovered, which is the participation model. So all together, this scale was was reliable. You can see the reliability statistics down here with an average of 3.31. And so I'll talk about each of those models individually, but I also did average them together to get just a general sense of Americans' engagement preferences. And then for beliefs about NASA, in terms of trust, I used questions from the Pew Research Center, which ask how much do you trust NASA to, and then it's a scale from a completely distrust to completely trust. And so you can see the items here: make new discoveries about life in space, be truthful about discoveries made in the search for life in space, give you information about life on other planets, act in the best interest of Americans, act in the best interest of your community, and protect the public. So you can see those are also highly reliable. And in terms of NASA priorities, these are the priorities I measure, but I'm only going to be talking today about the first one. So how would you rate each of the following priorities for NASA's space efforts? And the first item being the search for life and planets that could support life. And that was reverse coded so that higher support equals believing it should be more of a priority for NASA. So final variable, I also wanted to measure general conspiratorial thinking. And fun fact, if you measure conspiratorial thinking among the public, a lot of the scales also include questions about aliens and extraterrestrial life. And so I use this scale here. The full scale has 15 items, and it's the generic conspiracist belief scale. I have some of the items on the screen for you here. Again, highly reliable, and it has items. So participants had to rate these statements from definitely not true to definitely true. So the statements included things like the government is involved in the murder of innocent citizens or well-known public figures and keeps this a secret. The power held by heads of state is second to that of a small unknown groups who really control world politics. Secret organizations communicate with extraterrestrials but keep this fact from the public. The spread of certain viruses and or diseases is the result of deliberate concealed efforts of some organizations. So you can see how this scale kind of touches on conspiratorial thinking, broadly speaking, about different topics, but also integrates perceptions of UFOs and the search for extraterrestrial life. So for these research questions, so number one, I wanted to know, to what extent do Americans believe that extraterrestrial life exists? It turns out most do. So most Americans believe that other planets other than Earth do indeed harbor life. So only 20% agree that Earth is the only planet in the universe that harbors life. And about a third are unsure, and most, which is about 51%, Sorry, disagree and agree. So most those, sorry, that's a typo. But most Americans do believe that other planets do harbor life. 2/3 of Americans also agree that given the size and age of the universe, it is very likely that extraterrestrial life must exist. Additionally, many Americans believe that intelligent extraterrestrial life has visited Earth. So, importantly, only 22% in my survey sample said they don't believe that intelligent extraterrestrial life has visited Earth. The remaining either said they weren't sure, didn't know what to believe either way, or that they agreed that indeed extraterrestrial life did visit Earth. For research question 2, to what extent do Americans support the scientific search for extraterrestrial life? Most Americans do support the scientific search. More than half agreed or strongly agreed that the search for extraterrestrial life is a serious and important scientific endeavor, and only about 17.5% disagreed that it was an important scientific endeavor. And the vast majority of Americans believe that searching for life and planets that support life should be a priority for NASA, with 1/3 saying it should be a top priority. So 1/3 of the sample said not only should NASA be doing this, it should be one of their top priorities. Interestingly, though, if you look at the support for the search for extraterrestrial life, like seeing it as an important scientific endeavor, which is the blue bar, and then you compare it for support for government funding. So there was a survey item that asked, governments should increase their funding to support this kind of scientific work. Support for the funding is a little bit lower, which is interesting. So there fewer Americans strongly agreed that government should put funding toward that arena, compared to those that agreed that it should be something that science is doing. For research question 3, what is the relationship between support for the scientific search for extraterrestrial life and conspiratorial thinking? So I obviously captured quite a bit of conspiratorial beliefs. It depends on kind of how you define it and how you look at it. I'm going to talk about 4 different aspects of conspiratorial thinking here, and look at how it correlates with support for the scientific search for life. So first and foremost, belief in a cover-up conspiracy about alien life is fairly high. So 45% of Americans believe that the US government, the military, and scientists know that extraterrestrial life exists and then is covering it up. 45%, like if you just think about that statistic, that's like almost half of Americans believe that powerful groups know that this type of life exists and that they're actively covering it up. About 1/3 aren't sure about a cover-up in the US government, military, and among scientists. But again, about half believe that a cover-up is indeed happening. And only about 1/4 said that they disagreed or strongly disagreed that there was a cover-up among those groups. And another fun statistic, 43% agreed that concrete evidence of extraterrestrials have been hidden from the general public. So in terms of what the relationship is then between beliefs about the scientific search for life and these kind of conspiratorial beliefs, I did find a positive correlation between general conspiratorial orientation, so that scale that asked about a whole bunch of different types of conspiracies, and support for the scientific search for life. So you can see the correlation statistics there. It was a positive but fairly small, significant but fairly small correlation to general conspiratorial thinking. Interestingly, there is a slightly larger positive correlation between reporting personal experiences. So the questions that asked, basically, have you or someone you know experienced things that you believe is evidence of extraterrestrial life? And you can see that correlation's a little bit stronger compared to general conspiratorial thinking or an orientation. And there's an even larger positive correlation between belief in an alien cover-up by powerful groups, so scientists, the military, and government, and support for the scientific search for life in space. So that correlation is even stronger. You can see the Pearson correlation is 0.449, and it is also significant. However, the strongest correlation I found between conspiratorial thinking and the search for life in space is the belief that aliens have visited the planet. So if Americans believe that alien life has already, or extraterrestrial life has already visited the planet, they are the correlation between that and support for the scientific search for life is even stronger. So that seems to be the element of conspiratorial thinking, if we want to call it that, which maybe not, that is most strongly correlated with the search for life in space. Some interesting demographic notes and differences for this research question. So general conspiratorial thinking is significantly correlated with being lower income, lower educated, highly religious, and politically conservative. Additionally, personal experiences with extraterrestrial life is significantly correlated with higher religiosity, but seems unrelated to income, education, or political ideology. Belief in an alien cover-up is significantly correlated with being lower educated and being politically conservative, but it is unrelated to someone's income level or religiosity. And then belief that aliens have visited Earth, that extraterrestrial life has visited Earth recently or in the past, is significantly correlated with lower education and higher religiosity, but unrelated to income or political ideology. So here is a chart of the correlations here to kind of capture what those relationships look like. And so you can look on the right-hand side, the general level of support for the scientific search for extraterrestrial life is positively correlated with one's education level, but also negatively correlated with one's level of religiosity, and then also negatively correlated with political conservatism. So the more liberal someone is, the more they support the scientific search for life. The higher educated they are, the more they support it. And religiosity was measured using a few items. So I asked how often do you attend church services? How often do you pray? And the questions, and how important is religion in your everyday life? So that's how religiosity was captured. And so also, what are Americans' engagement preferences surrounding the search for extraterrestrial life? So the key takeaway from the data in this space for me was that the desire for engagement and communication from scientists around the search for life in space is overall incredibly high. So about 90% of Americans believe that it is at least slightly important for scientists and experts to engage in the deficit model. So about 90% of Americans believe that, again, it's at least slightly important for experts and scientists to provide the public with information about current projects and findings related to the search for extraterrestrial life. So it's 92%, to be more specific. 90% believed that it was at least slightly important for scientists and experts to seek feedback from the public to better understand their values and beliefs about the search for extraterrestrial life. And then 89% believed that it was at least slightly important for scientists and experts to collaborate with the public to figure out how we should deal with extraterrestrial life if it is discovered, which is also the participation model of science communication. And if you look at, here's a comparison breaking down each model. So the yellow bar means that they rated that model as not at all important. The blue bar means they rated that model as slightly or moderately important. And the green bar means they rated that model as very or extremely important. So you can see each model is rated as fairly important, although the deficit model seems to be rated as kind of like more Americans believe that's very or extremely important for scientists to share their research. But still, support for all three of these models separately is very, very high. Relatedly, again, I asked how much do Americans trust NASA to protect and engage the public? So because NASA is one of the primary scientific organizations that's responsible for communicating about the search for life in space, I wanted to know, okay, what are your engagement preferences for science, but also how do you view this organization specifically? So trust in NASA and support for NASA's search for life in the universe is moderate. Distrust is fairly low. So the majority of Americans somewhat or completely trust NASA to do things like make new discoveries about life in space, be truthful about discoveries made in the search for life in space, give the public information about life on other planets, act in the best interest of Americans, and also protect the public. Interesting demographic notes and differences for research question 4. Overall, trust in NASA was significantly and positively correlated with believing in each model of engagement is important. So I did find a relationship between how much the public trusts NASA to communicate with them, engage with them, protect them, and act in their interest, and a desire for other scientists and experts to engage the public across all models of engagement. I did find one demographic difference in terms of engagement preferences, and that's that white participants ranked each model of public engagement as significantly more important than non-white. So that was across all models. And when you average them together, that's the mean scores here on the screen. So overall, average engagement preferences are a little bit higher among white participants. I also did find that conservative ideology is negatively correlated with the deficit model of engagement preferences, but you can see the statistic on the screen there, the correlation is significant, but it's fairly small. And political ideology was not a significant correlate to any other engagement preference or model of engagement. And fourth and finally, there was no relationship between engagement preferences, whether you look at each model or combine them all into one, and income, education, religiosity, or science knowledge, which is really interesting. Oftentimes, when we look at topics like climate change or GMOs, we do end up seeing variability in terms of how people want to be engaged about that issue, and variability across demographic lines. And for this issue, other than conservative ideology being negatively correlated with the deficit model preference, there isn't a ton of demographic, at least for the demographics listed on the screen, there isn't a ton of kind of demographic variability in terms of engagement preference. So some of the key takeaways from this work. Number one, the support for the scientific search for extraterrestrial life is high overall, but it is lower among the religious and politically conservative. There are fairly high levels of conspiratorial thinking, which almost higher than I expected, which might have been naive of me. But for example, even a mean of 1.8 or 1.9 on a 5-point scale that asks like, have you been abducted, and has someone been abducted, feels higher than what I expected it to. And so believing that you have kind of direct lived experience, or someone has direct lived experience, is that belief is actually higher than I expected among the American public. And the conspiratorial thinking being correlated with political conservatism and also religiosity does suggest a really complex communication landscape, especially because support for science is increasingly politicized, which makes communicating about science across political lines challenging anyway. And because the implications for the search for extraterrestrial life are so huge, I mean, like it has huge implications for the way we see humanity and our role in the universe. And so it also then is going to bump up against one's religious beliefs. And so because conspiratorial thinking, at least in this sample, seems to be more highly related with those, or more common with those who are highly religious, or have high levels of religiosity, that is going to further complicate and challenge science communicators when they are trying to reach those groups. Third, desired engagement from scientific experts across various models is incredibly high, and incredibly high across most demographic groups. So this study does support NASA's efforts to improve their understanding and approach toward communicating with public audiences, because it's fairly clear, at least from this data, that Americans do want that kind of engagement. So they want scientists to be telling them about their work. They want scientists to be asking the public what they think. They also want scientists to be asking the public about what the science looks like and kind of the how we use science and what the results are there. For future work, so what I showed you today is mostly, descriptive, correlational. It's pretty kind of a basic look at the data and what I found. But future work should conduct more sophisticated analyses, like latent profile analysis, to further refine audience segments. So if you look at topics like climate communication or communication with GMOs, audience segmentation research, there's lots of it, right? So lots of researchers have tried to identify what are the unique types of audiences that exist in the United States for these different science topics. So if you think about like Global Warming 6 Americas is a really great example of how we can use psychographics and other data to help us identify these unique groups. And there is a desperate need to do that for this type of science as well. And especially refining it beyond demographics, because even though the current study found differences along demographic lines, whether that be religiosity or political conservatism, I'm not convinced that dividing people by demographics is actually that helpful in terms of science communication strategy. And so while demographics may play a role and may be important, it is also really vital to use other psychographic data and other data about kind of attitudes, beliefs, behaviors. And for me personally, I'm really interested in using how the public thinks about science, generally speaking. So I'm a philosophy nerd, if anyone else loves philosophy. And a big part of my research program is looking at how people's epistemic assumptions about science, generally speaking, relate to their engagement preferences and beliefs, particularly about controversial science like climate change. And so there is a really big opportunity here to look at the way that people think about science knowledge generally and kind of map that onto, to what extent does that relate to conspiratorial thinking? Are there groups that kind of have a general conspiracist orientation, but they don't actually have that much conspiracist orientation about extraterrestrial life specifically? Like, are those groups different? Is it the case that if someone has conspiracy theories about one topic, they're going to have it about all of them, which I believe most research shows that that tends to be the case. But is that the case for extraterrestrial life? And how does one's orientation towards science as a way of knowing relate to what they think about this issue, how much they support it as a scientific issue, what they see it, how they see it as a religious issue, a moral issue, an ethical issue, a philosophical issue, and also how do they prefer to be engaged about this issue? Thank you so much. So I do want to shout out my collaborator, Dr. Rachel Norda. She's the director of the book publishing program at Portland State University. She and I worked on this project together. So we also, not presented today, but we also do have data about Americans' media habits and the types of media genres they consume, including science fiction. And so we're also going to be digging into what the relationship is between consuming science fiction, popular culture, books, podcasts, movies, TV shows, and how that relates to one's perceptions of extraterrestrial life in space. Thank you so much.